Good evening, all of you. I welcome you all on day 4 of the 7-day faculty development program on literary theory. Today we have with us Dr. V. Vinod Balakrishnan, Professor of English, Department of Humanities and Social Science, National Institute of Technology, Tiruchirappalli. This is the first time that we have invited Sir for a lecture of this sort. But then years ago, when National College Trichy initiated its NetSec program, Sir was a part of it. Sir used to visit on the last day of the program, the 7th or the 8th day. And we were aspirants of NetSet then, and we used to wait eagerly for Sir's class. Sir would come only for half a day, and he would talk on literary theory, and we would all wait the whole week waiting as to when Sir would arrive. And Sir would talk on a literary theory in his own unique style, so patiently, cogently, and lucidly. So it's almost after 10 years that I'm getting an opportunity today, once again, to listen to Sir speak on a literary theory. Thank you so much, Sir, for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Sir. I spoke to Sir just a while ago, around 4 o'clock. He told me that he was leaving his institute just then. He must have got home only now, I guess. So it's a long day for Sir, but without any hesitation, he immediately accepted our invitation and we are ever grateful for it, Sir. Thank you so much. And Sir has decided to speak today on new criticism. So when new criticism came to fore sometime during the middle of the 20th century, it was very popular and it kind of tried to make its or force its intellectual magic on the readers of literature. Why? Because it just made one demand, that is to read the text. All other kinds of external influences like say the historical connections or the biographical connections was all discredited. It was cast away. So in this sense, this particular theory or literary practice is very, very important. Why? Because here the text and text alone is of colossal importance. So I'm very eager with all of you to listen to Sir's take on new criticism. And now I call upon Dr. Sumati K. Swami, Associate Professor, Department of English, to deliver a formal welcome address and to introduce the chief guest of the day. Good luck to all of you.
Good evening to one and all present. The 7-day faculty development program on literary theory organized by the Department of English, PHR Krishnammal College for Women, Coimbatore, is yet another benchmark in academic excellence, for it is a platform to enhance the development of language and other thinking skills that provide the foundation for learning. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome the luminaries and participants for this FDP in Zoom platform and on YouTube. Sri Govindarajulu and Srimati Chandragandhi Govindarajulu, the visionary founders of this prestigious institution, would have been extremely proud to see how their seed of social responsibility has grown into a massive tree, spreading its branches far and wide. The institution they founded in 1963, aiming to empower women through education, has risen to Himalayan heights. It is now a college of excellence, ranked 6th in NIRF ranking and A++ grade in the NAT. Concerned with the development of the faculty along with its students, the institution organizes various workshops and faculty development programs. Srimati R. Nandini, our founder trustee, Dr. N. Yashoda Devi, secretary, Dr. S. Nirmala, principal, Dr. Mrs. R. Padmavati, former head of the Department of English, and our mentor have been pillars of support and encouragement in all our ventures. Dr. Sushil Mary Matthews, the head of the Department of English, and Dr. V. Madangi, staff coordinator of the Literary Debating Association, have put in great efforts to organize this FDP. I deem it a great honor and privilege to welcome our honorable resource person of the day, Dr. Vinod Balakrishnan, professor in English in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the National Institute of Technology, Trichy. It is impossible to just say a few words about Sir, for he is not just a professor of English, He's a poet, a motivational speaker, editor, reviewer of books, and yoga enthusiast. He has been a very active student since his school days, earning a lot of awards, including the Outstanding School Student Award in 1984, presented by the Rocktown JCs. His college days were filled with laurels too, with him receiving the award for outstanding performance in academics every year consecutively from 1989 to 1991. He has made his mark in extracurricular field and sports, and by being a member of the debate team and cricket team of St. Joseph's College, Trichy. Dr. Vinod Balakrishnan earned his PhD in popular fiction and the use of history from Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. Not only did he receive JRF from UGC 1991, he was a fellow at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell University, New York in 2008 as well. He has the associateship of the UGC Inter-University Center of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, from 2016. With all these academic credits, he has proved his mettle in creative writing with his poems and articles, which have been published in various journals and anthologies, including Indian Literature, published by Sahitya Academy and the Indian Express. He has won the Bronze Medal for Poetry by the National Library of Poetry USA and the Editor's Choice Award for Outstanding Achievement in Poetry, presented by Poetry.com and the International Library of Poetry, twice in 1997 and 2000. Apart from these credentials, his research articles have appeared in various prestigious journals indexed in Web of Sciences, Scopus, UGC Care, including Catalan Journal of Communication and Cultural Studies, European Journal of Humor Research, Journal of Dharma, Pragmatism Today, and Journal of English Language Teaching, to mention a few. His research interests includes somatics, politics of representation, film studies, life writing, and narratives about India. Currently, he is working on the role of public intellectual and the future of the humanities. It is a great honor to have such an eminent personality as a resource person today to give a lecture on new criticism. Welcome, sir. I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Sushil Mary Matthews, Dr. Madangi, my colleagues in the Department of English, P.H.R. Krishnamal College for Women, and the teaching fraternity and learned participants from far and near who are attending this FDP. I hope you have a fruitful session. Welcome one and all. Thank you.
Over to you, sir. Sir, kindly unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you. Can I share my PPT?
Yes, sir, you can do that, sir.
Do that. Soft screen. I suppose my screen is visible to all of you.
It is visible, sir.
Right. So without much ado, let me thank Matangi for sounding like the Southern agrarian, very nostalgic for what happened some 10 years ago. I do remember with fondness my association with National College, particularly Professor Bennett, who was organizing the NET and SLET workshop for aspirants. I thank Madam Sumati for those very fine words of introduction. It felt as if it's a different person altogether. And I greet all the participants, faculty participants to this talk. It's a great afternoon. I wish you a wonderful weekend. Maybe after the talk, you will start enjoying the weekend. So my talk is on new criticism. But I have a reason to talk about new criticism. This talk is placed between two bookends. The first bookend is Stephen Greenblatt. His Shakespearean negotiations is the point where I begin. And I hope to conclude with Rennie Welleck and Austin Warren's book, Theory of Literature. So the talk on new criticism would happen between these two bookends. And let me begin with Stephen Greenblatt. All of us know what a fabulous scholar Greenblatt is, especially those fantastic books he has written on Shakespeare. In fact, a marvelous archival effort to bring back Shakespeare. In fact, the line with which he opens Shakespearean negotiations is one of the finest and most quotable lines by anybody, not just a creative person, professor, but anybody who writes English. It's one of the finest lines you can think of. And I thought, as readers, this will be a line that will grow on us. We would grow to understand its importance. And it reads, I began with the desire to speak with the dead. And in that opening passage, Greenblatt says something which would actually place this talk in context for us. He says, and I quote, literature professors are salaried middle-class shamans. A shaman is a person who is divinely or magically inspired to come up and say some very meaningful things which involve the lives of other people. So, and at that point, the shaman is a medium. He is not the author of what he says. He is more of a medium because there is some divine energy or a divine idea that is being conducted through him like electricity, and he only brings it into the world. So and that is how Greenblatt describes the English professor, the literature professor, salaried middle-class shaman. And I thought what the new critics were doing was that they were performing like shamans, but like unlike most of the literature professors, the new critics were drawing our attention to the text as sacrosanct. While most professors of literature are trying to educate us, show us ways of reading and reading texts, the very ingenious ways in which we would be reading texts, the effective tools by which we would be unlocking even hermetic closed texts, the magical ways in which we would be able to construct a network of connections by which we read one text in its relation to and in its resonance with other texts and so on. So that is what any literature professor worth his salt is trying to do. And the new critics were trying to, in their own way, create a culture of reading. So in this talk, the key word is culture, And the word that we may not actually be repeating as many times as we would repeat culture is reading. Now, staying on the idea of the literature professor as a shaman, I would also like to contextualize this talk as the destiny of the English department, and historically the fate of the English department, which starts somewhere in England about the 1830s, 1840s, but then as a recognized institutional entity somewhere in the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, 1917, and so on. So we are also talking about the fortunes of the English department. So it's just not new criticism. I thought we need to remember that the context of new criticism should at any point of time consider the destiny of the English department. So we would start our story here. This is Frederick Denison Morris, who was a priest and a theologian, lived between 1805 and 1872. So the major part of the 19th century. And we would also reckon that it also coincides with the Victorian era. And he was classically trained, and he was the first chair of English at Trinity College, at the University College, London. And then he also became the founder principal of Queen's College, London. So in a sense, the English department owes its origins to the work of a priest and a theologian like F.D. Morris. And long before, so when I invoked Stephen Greenblatt, I meant that we would have to actually shake hands with many of these precursors, forerunners to the new critics. And while we would want to see the new critics as heralding this culture of reading, we would have to see that in the context of a number of influential cultural personalities who have facilitated the conditions for the new critics to happen, to flourish, and then do things the way they went about doing. So we would hence start with the man who is identified as commencing English studies, and given his classical training in Latin and Greek, himself a theologian, he insisted on close reading. And Morris's time coincided with a people's movement called the Carpist Movement of about 10 years between 1838 and 1848. So this was a movement for political reform. And to people like a conservative like Morris, this seemed like a threat to the citadel of culture. It seemed like the coming of anarchy and the old order being completely overturned. And so Morris saw in the English language the road to safety and salvation. So he believed that the classics, especially in English language, that promoted a spirit of nationalism must be encouraged, and the middle class must be targeted, who would be drawn into the study of these texts through English, and the literary text would then become the vehicle for the consolidation of a nationalistic spirit. So you can see how the beginnings of English as a language is not just a matter of culture, but then it is also closely intertwined with political culture. Next, a contemporary of Morris, but whose work is also recognized, went on to dominate the Victorian era because Matthew Arnold held some important public responsibilities, positions like the inspector of schools. So he was directly involved in the pedagogical system and the reforms that were necessary in the pedagogical system. Now, while Morris would want the middle class to be targeted because once we can have their loyalty through English and build a nationalistic spirit, then we would actually be saving England from descending into anarchy, was how Morris thought about his plans. But Matthew Arnold felt that the middle class was already sold to the idea of industrialization, and so they were becoming more and more materialistic, and they did not have the culture, by which Matthew Arnold means a lot of things. We will come to that shortly. So he felt that the middle class needs to be chastised for its excessive materialism, and he could not stomach the fact that they were also becoming culturally hostile to cultural traditions. So in his very well-known treatise, Culture and Anarchy, he would call the middle class Philistines. Now, that's an interesting word. So we would be able to see that this is not just a word that has a biblical echo. Matthew Arnold uses this term in a sociological context. Philistine, as far as Matthew Arnold is concerned, he uses it as a word that has its origins in Germany, especially in the city of Jena. Jena, we would know, is this university city where the great Hegel taught. So that center of Western European culture and modern philosophy, Jena is that university city. In 1689, there was a clash between the university students and the townsfolk. And the term that the university students used for their antagonists, the townsfolk with whom they came to blows, is Philister. Now, Philister is a German word which means one who is not educated at the university. So a person who does not possess the aesthetic and intellectual culture that he would get from the university, such a person is a Philistine. And it is in that sense that Arnold uses the word Philistine. Now, it's very interesting that when the new critics in America, especially when Robert Penn Warren and Cleant Brooks write and publish their understanding poetry and understanding fiction, understanding poetry, to which I'll come in a while, they prepare a manifesto for the university student as to how this student must cultivate this aesthetic and intellectual culture, by which they mean a culture of reading poetry. And by that, they would mean all the creative excellence that one can see in a cultural sphere. To Arnold, culture as a liberal, culture is, as opposed to a Philistine, a liberal, the best that is thought and written in the world. And it's very interesting how Arnold looks at poetry. Without poetry, he says in his study of poetry, our science will appear incomplete. And most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. So you can hear an echo of Philip Sidney, who chooses poetry above history and philosophy in an apology for poetry, but that is once again a long-running debate. And that debate, we should assume, has not abated, and in Arnold's time, it only gathers a little more momentum. And he sees poetry providing the succor that philosophy and religion are not able to provide. So poetry is that cultural sphere which is like a stay against the desolation in the world, and something that promises much more than what philosophy or religion cannot provide. And that is why when he talks about the poem, he says the classical poets possessed two qualities. One is a sense of truth, the highest truth, and a sense of high seriousness, spudietis as he calls it. And we would also see that there is a political moralism in the position of Arnold. And his idea of liberal education is a close application, a close reading of the cultural texts and a critical reflection. So what I'm trying to do by bringing the ghosts of people before even the new critics can be announced is that we would see a continuity of these concerns, and it is not as if these interests suddenly erupted in the scheme of things. In 1833, William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, awarded an annual pension of £250 to Arnold, and in recognition of his service, which he registers as, and I quote, a public recognition of service to the poetry and the literature of England. So we see two things there, very interesting: service to the poetry and the literature. So this is towards the end of the 19th century, and we would wait another 10 or 15 years for the English department to come into existence, almost 20 years before Cambridge has its first English department. The English Tripos begins in Cambridge around 1917, and that is where we would pick up thread at the Cambridge University, particularly the scene dominated by the camp of the Lewises, F.R. Lewis and his wife, Queenie Lewis, and the other camp, not exactly a rival camp, the other camp of I.A. Richards and C.K. Ogden and William Empson, and then proceeding to include T.S. Eliot and so on. So we would shift our story to Cambridge University. You would see on the left F.R. Lewis, and on the right I.A. Richards, Ivor Armstrong Richards, two phenomenal figures, two pillars of English studies, and two different cultures of reading. Now, if you go to the Scrutiny, which is the collection, the literary journal that F.R. Lewis wrote in, he founded the journal and he wrote his brilliant reviews, but a little idiosyncratic reviews, but any day, amazingly brilliant reviews on the writers of his time. That was pure literature. And I would say that these are two different cultures of reading. The F.R. Lewis, who wrote his reviews in the Scrutiny, and we can see what he meant by scrutiny, a close attention. F.R. Lewis would say that in order to understand literature, one would have to read, and then he would say read again, and then read again. So he was championing the mantra of reading texts, and that's the only way we would get to know them better. I.A. Richards, in his practical criticism and even in his philosophy of literature, was not saying anything different. He was also saying you need to read, but he was saying you need to read in a way that is very different from the method advocated by or championed by the Lewises. So I would say that those two important spheres that Gladstone mentions in his citation for Arnold, the service to poetry, we would pick I.A. Richards, and service to literature, we would pick F.R. Lewis. But this is a very simplistic separation, two mighty figures. In 1941, John Crowe Ransom, the man who is credited with coining the term New Criticism, and also in 1941 publishing his collection of essays titled The New Criticism, he pays tribute to I.A. Richards. He says, discussion of the new criticism must start with Mr. Richards. The new criticism very nearly began with him. So that's interesting. He recognizes I.A. Richards as the originator of this culture of reading called new criticism. But let us not assume that I.A. Richards was all about just close reading and practical criticism. No, I.A. Richards is an encyclopedic personality. His interests are quite wide and varied. In fact, his contributions to semiotics have even influenced 20th century thinkers and philosophers of language like Umberto Eco. His triangle of the symbol, the referent, and the thought is something that has influenced modern day semioticians. So he was one who could contribute to the study of language and the semiosis, and in extension, so he's a kind of a forefather of media studies, if we may. And then his deep interest in science, especially in neuroscience and psychology, did make him an important person talking about or even contributing to the growing interest in psychoanalysis, or this interface between psychology and the literature. What Wellek and Austin and Wellek in the theory of literature would call this extrinsic approach of literature and psychology. But for I.A. Richards, psychology was so important, not only as a tool, but as a vocabulary to interpret texts. So a very, very fine mind, one whose interests were quite wide. Then he was also a philosopher who was a Benthamite. So he was, that's why he would, in his approach to literature, talk about literature as providing us valuable experience, not just an experience or not any experience. It is the Benthamite philosopher in him that makes him look for literature providing through its pseudo statements, not the statement, the denotative statement of science, but the connotative statement of literature, the pseudo statements that do give us valuable experience. It orders our world in a much more credible manner than we would be able to do that through either philosophy or religion, and hence the need to cultivate in the university critical thinking. And it is only in continuation of this project of promoting critical thinking that he brings these protocols to classes, distributes them, and then we have what is called practical criticism, the text on the page. And so there is no eccentric movement away from the text. I thought John Crowe Ransom is right, largely, to a large extent right, in recognizing I.A. Richards' position as one of the originators of new criticism. But even a little before I.A. Richards, there is this person. I thought I was a little amused that the histories of literary criticism, even M.H. Abrams does not mention this person, Joel Spingarn. Joel Spingarn is an interesting character. He taught at Columbia University, and he was quite an influential intellectual, a public intellectual of his time. He was a Jew, but he, even in those days, in the he lived between the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century. So Joel Spingarn is a Jew who advocated a more integrated community. He spoke for inclusiveness. He spoke for civil rights. In fact, one of the most prestigious awards, which recognizes an individual's work to the liberation of the African Americans, is the Spingarn Medal. And distinguished African American intellectuals like Du Bois have won the Spingarn Medal, and that is the man. And Cleanth Brooks also seconds Ransom, and he says that I.A. Richards must be given credit and ransom, because Cleanth Brooks went to Cambridge with I.A. Richards, and I thought that is the link that brings new criticism to America. I should like to think like that. But Brooks also says that it was Ransom whose naming of that practice or the culture of reading as new criticism makes him the one who identified new criticism, but not the case. I would draw our attention to March 9th, 1910. And this is a lecture delivered by Spingarn in his capacity as a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. And this lecture uncannily was titled The New Criticism. So almost a full 30 years before John Crowe Ransom could coin the term, Spingarn had delivered a lecture on the new criticism. And I have some excerpts from the new criticism for our group. And we can see the connection between and how how tremendously prescient Spingarn is, and how he even anticipates a practice like the new criticism. It's very uncanny that he talks about everything that the new critics in Nashville, Tennessee would go on to champion as if it is a new practice. We will come to the sociological, historical, cultural conditions in a short while. Now, Spingarn, we would know, was in correspondence with one of the most influential philosopher of his time, the Italian aesthetician and philosopher Benedetto Croce. Interesting that the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica carries the entry Aesthetics, written by Benedetto Croce, the philosopher. And Spingarn has had a very long correspondence since 1899 with Benedetto Croce. Croce has this to say about aesthetics and art, and we would connect Croce with Spingarn and see that these minds have already prepared the ground for new criticism. The others are only packaging the old wine in new bottles. Art embodies not beauty, but expression, or the coherent movement of the will. So this is Benedetto Croce on art. He also talks about a poem. We will come to that soon. I will repeat that statement, and let us dwell on the terms. Art embodies, so something concrete. Art is not just an airy something, it embodies not beauty but expression. So in language, so there is something concrete happening in language. We should now start thinking about the imagist practice of poetry, the symbolist movement in poetry. So we should think of Ezra Pound, we should think of Eliot. Art embodies not beauty but expression. And we can already hear Eliot at the back of our heads, Eliot in Tradition and the Individual Talent, or the coherent movement of the will. It's putting together, there is a certain a centrifugal energy of all the parts coming together into one integrated whole. And this is precisely the model or the structure of the poem that the new critics would champion when they come on the scene. Then, so coherence means that no element goes outside the text under consideration. Everything moves centrifugally inside, all right? Centripetally is moving out, centripetally inside. So coherent within itself. Now, to be a poem, two constant and necessary elements are necessary, and he says, a complex of images and a feeling that animates them. So this is the idea of a poem for Benedetto Croce. We will come to Spingarn, who echoes the same idea, a complex of images and a feeling that animates them. So now you have, and this is exactly, now let's think of what T.S. Eliot would say about the metaphysical poets, and then by celebrating them, bring them into the 20th century as the model for the modernist poet. So you have a complex of images and a feeling that animates them. When he talks about the metaphysicals, he could say that they were able to, in one moment, bring together their feeling and a thought. All right. So he talks about how they were capable of this unification of sensibility, of a feeling and a thought. So there are images, the thought and the feeling, they happen together. And that is the metaphysical quality of poetry. And the poem is mere images, not history or historical criticism. Eliot would say in The Wasteland, Son of Man, you only know a heap of broken images. And then Croce once again saying a feeling which is our own, no less than the poet's. So the reader and the poet, they are alike when it comes to the feeling. Why? Because the poet is not providing his feeling, the poet is providing like a catalyst. We know the formula that Eliot talks about, a scientific formula where there is a catalyst which participates in the process but is able to depersonalize itself. All right, be present but then not impress the personality. So he says poetry is not an expression of personality but an escape from personality. So you have the same idea from Lefort to Benedetto Croce, through Lefort to Eliot, the impersonality theory. Now let's get back to Spingarn. I said very strange that even M.H. Abrams in his beautiful glossary, which has been revised over the years, doesn't remember Spingarn. And Spingarn's The New Criticism between 1911 and 1962, fairly long period of time, between about 50 years. In 50 years' time, this lecture was published almost 6 times, and it was not taken notice of. And something that happened in 1941 was suddenly picked up as an important phenomenon. Now, we wouldn't see a clearer manifesto of the new critical movement than what we would see in Spingarn. The new critical movement, they have expressed their manifesto in Understanding Poetry, in Criticism Inc. by John Crowe Ransom, in the New Criticism, and in the journals that they started, like The Fugitive, which was started earlier than the other two very famous journals, the Kenyon Review and the Sivani Review. Now, let us take the first statement. In every age, impressionism or enjoyment and dogmatism or judgment have grappled with one another. So that is the first point. So we can see how Spingarn in this one statement is anticipating I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards makes a difference between valuable experience and mere pleasure. So there is a certain way in which we would read literature. We would read literature superficially and it is only pleasure, but we would read it with great attention to its structural elements, detail, and then it gives us valuable experience. He makes this distinction between pleasure and experience. Why? Spingarn's idea of new criticism even anticipates the culture of reading that Barthes talks about. Roland Barthes, the structuralist critic, talks about the idea of the author and how there are texts which are writerly, which only provide, which readerly texts which only provide pleasure, and then writerly texts which requires a great, a fulsome participation of the reader, the writerly text which can provide bliss, jouissance, as he calls it. So this debate or this conflict between impressionism, pleasure or enjoyment and judgment, it keeps happening. Moving on to the second excerpt. The problem is not, this is Spingarn again, the problem is not how to determine by what mechanism Addison composed sentences and struck out similitudes, but by what far finer and more mysterious mechanism Shakespeare organized his dramas. So we are anticipating two important discussions in the context, in the cultural context of new criticism. There is the essays, the companion essays by Wimsatt and Beardsley. One is the affective fallacy, the other is the intentional fallacy. So the affective fallacy is impressionism, how a reader takes a text. I thought this was one of the more prominent ways in which literary texts were done by great eloquent professors in the class who read the text and then expostulated on those, elucidated those texts with their scholarship, and but it was impressionistic all the same. So they would the text would only be a takeoff point, and then they would freely roam around and gather the beauties of the other texts, keep quoting references from other texts, and make the text more cosmopolitan. And then the other one is the intentional fallacy, where we are more interested in what the author was thinking when he did something or when he wrote a line, like Robert Browning asking, what porridge did Keats take, you know, while he wrote Ode on the Grecian Urn. But so these are fallacies. Spingarn is already anticipating the discussion on the fallacies and pointing us towards the text, gently goading us to turn to the text. And similar to the second excerpt, not only who was the poet and how did he compose, but what and how was the poem and why was it a poem, and not rhymed eloquence, creation and not figured passion. So he is drawing attention to the text as an entity in itself, what Cleant Brooks would call the verbal icon. We will come to that soon. Now, excerpt 3 is on unity. So what is this unity? And can our deeper inspection discern it to be indivisible and existing by necessity? Because each work springs, as it were, from the general elements of thought and grows up therefrom into form and expansion by its own growth. So there is an idea of the text as an organic entity that we can see there. We would be able to trace then some of the luminaries in the literary or the poetic tradition of England, of the English-speaking world, where the idea of the text as an organic entity has been continuing. It is not as if even Spingarn is articulating it for the first time. The earliest discussion of the unity of the text we would be able to see in Aristotle, where he talks about the harmony of the matter of presentation and the manner of presentation, the tragedy which must have a proper beginning, a convincing middle, and a reasonably concluding end, where everything, all complications are resolved. When we move to the Romantic poet and philosopher like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in the Biographia Literaria, he talks about the two interesting images for the structure of the poem or the movement of the poem, especially talking about the harmony between the parts and the whole. The two images, one is the image of the snake, the movement of the snake. He refers to the Egyptians. The snake moves, and he also, the other image is that of sound waves, the propagation of sound waves. So there are compressions. The snake compresses its body, then expands, and then compresses and expands, and that's how the snake moves. You would be able to see the same principle in the way waves or sound waves are propagated. There is a phase of compression, then rarefaction, compression, then rarefaction, and that's how the wave is carried forward. Now, we have the images of the snake and propagation of sound for the harmony between the parts and the whole in Coleridge. In Eliot, we have the idea of the poet getting out of the text so that there is the text with which the reader interacts. And then the philosophy of composition, Edgar Allan Poe, who talks about the need for a poem to be about 100 lines long. Why? Because you would be able to read it in one sitting. Longer than that, the affairs of the world, the cares of the world will interfere, and we would not be able to enjoy the poem in one sitting. So that one sitting is the unity that Spingarn also alludes in his talk on the new criticism. So let's, so it is not the inherent function of poetry to further any moral or social cause. So that is to provide a lesson or a moral. That is not the job of the poet. So let's summarize Spingarn. Focus the text, not the poet. The text has an internal unity and a structure that needs to be appreciated. So there is the organicist theory that we can subscribe to. We read the language of poetry. So we don't read poetry as a sentimental indulgence. It is the language of poetry with which we are engaging. I'll see if there is a little time to take up one small section of a beautiful essay. In fact, one of the finest essays and the signal new critical demonstration that we would be able to see, Cleanth Brooks's discussion of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. And there is no compulsion to provide any moral on the side of the poet. So Cleanth Brooks, one of the leading lights of the new critical movement. I will come back to a small demonstration of his reading. Now let us see if Cleanth Brooks is saying anything very different, almost 40 years after Spingarn, when he says these are his articles of faith, and let me read them out to the class. The primary concern of criticism is with the problem of unity. In a successful work, form and content cannot be separated. So are you able to hear anything very different from what Spingarn had already said, or from the ideas that had been gathering in the tradition of poetry appreciation? Literature is ultimately metaphorical and symbolic. The idea of the image in Benedetto Croce. You get to the general and universal not through abstraction, but through the concrete, in particular, the idea of the image, the concrete image. And it is not the purpose of literature to point a moral. And these are the articles of faith. And you can see the title of the book that collects essays on paradox and the language of paradox, and how Cleanth Brooks demonstrates his reading, new critical reading of some of the famous poems. And that is this book. We will come back to Keats and his urn in a while. Now, let us see if Ransom is saying anything different. Ransom says there are a few exclusions the literature professor needs to make in the class while you teach poetry. So let us see if he is saying anything very different. It is the teaching of poetry is an act now notoriously arbitrary and undefined. So criticism, he means criticism, by which he means the teaching of literature, by which he implies the teaching of poetry. It is an act now notoriously arbitrary and undefined. And so he insists on a few exclusions. What are the points to be excluded? The practices, personal registrations, how the professor feels about the text. Then synopsis and paraphrase, providing notes about the text. This is what Chaucer said. This is what happens in Hamlet, and so on. Historical studies, like even predicting as to what would have happened if Shakespeare had had a sister, remembering Virginia Woolf. Linguistic studies, by which was a major preoccupation in the German approach to literature and literary texts, where philology was such an important part of the understanding of texts. Then moral studies, where literature becomes the proxy for religion or philosophy, and any other special studies based on some abstract content taken out of the work. So we would want to see how Foucault is relevant in nursing, how Deleuze is relevant in baking of cakes, and so on. So a lot of very interesting ideas. These are to be excluded. And this is speaking in the spirit of the new critics. Now, there are three factors which led to the emergence of the new critics or new criticism. The first one, the emergence of the fugitives of the Southern agrarians. They were essentially, the Southern agrarians were essentially 12 Southern poets, poets like John Crowe Ransom. Cleanth Brooks joins them. Then you had Robert Penn Warren, who goes on to be the poet laureate of America and a very influential voice. And they come together, and put together their manifesto, their literary manifesto, which is also a political manifesto, which is titled in 1930. So that's once again 20 years after Spingarn's lecture. I'll take my stand, the South and the agrarian tradition. And most of these professors were either students or professors at Vanderbilt University, Nashville, Tennessee. And so they were called the Nashville agrarians, the Tennessee agrarians, the Southern agrarians, the Vanderbilt agrarians, and so on. And they were also called the fugitives because they were part of the fugitive journal that they started, which was active for 3 years between 1922 and 1925. Essentially conservative cast of mind who were like Arnold, who was intolerant of the growing industrialization and how the middle class was weaned away from culture towards a hostility towards culture and a materialistic way of life. So the Southern agrarians adopted a return to the agricultural values, and so a nostalgia for the Southern life. But of course, they don't talk about the slavery that existed at that time. But then, other than that, all the beautiful things of their life. And so in a sense, we would see the echoes of Matthew Arnold and before him, Wordsworth in the writings of the Southern agrarian. So that's one factor for the emergence of new criticism. The second factor is a history, once again, where actual history, for the new critics, actual history gave them the Second World War, the Cold War, and a lot of enmity among communities. So it was a condition, real history for them tended more towards anarchy, like Byzantium or you know what Yeats would call things fall apart. The center cannot hold, the things fall apart. And anarchy is let loose, is what he says, exactly what the new critics felt at that time. So you can see it was probably the zeitgeist, it was in the air. And so the literary text then became the epitome of order, of a structure, of harmony, of unity, and and a refuge from alienation. So the celebration of the text as you know, that which can stand in for actual history, a kind of a quasi-history which will provide a greater sense of order, a sense of restoration, a recovery of the lost order, and so on. The third one is the second generation of the student community that was really bursting. Its population was expanding. And so there was a need in the universities because these were students who were coming from different communities, different cultures. And at that time, America was a melting pot. Today, America is multicultural. So it's a little the converse of the melting pot. But a melting pot is where everything is homogenized. And so in that spirit, people like Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks suggested that there should be a strong movement where students could have a standard approach to the reading and appreciation of literature and literary texts. So they felt that that would be one way of promoting a healthy culture, a culture of reading. And to them, that seemed like a more democratically viable activity. And the new American experience, the melting pot situation, which for them necessitated the need to understand poetry on their own terms. And this is, it opens with a letter to the teacher. Of course, this book is, you know, a different, a number of lyrical poems collected under different heads like metrics, narrative poem, descriptive poem, and so on. But understanding poetry opens with a letter to the teacher. And these are some very respectable professors from Columbia University, University of California, Vanderbilt University, and so on. And even one of the most respected teachers, Van Doren of Columbia University. So all of them write this letter to the teacher, and these are the teachers of America who would be reading poetry in the schools and colleges and universities. And it says, this book has been conceived on the assumption that if poetry is worth teaching at all, it's worth teaching as poetry. So I would not linger here longer than this, but draw attention of the members to this beautiful poem about the same time by this remarkable person called Archibald MacLeish, a fantastic poem called Ars Poetica. And it opens with, it ends with this line, a poem should not mean but be. And the first line is palpable. So we have a demonstration of new criticism, the idea of an image, how palpable and mute. The image doesn't speak, but then an image is palpable. You can touch it, you can feel it, and there is no need to talk about it. And the image doesn't talk to you. You know, there is no telling, there is a lot of showing. So palpable and mute as a global fruit, as a globed fruit. And then these are three other images that we have. You can feel it, you can get the texture of it. So much is the concrete particular that Brooks talks about. Dumb as old medallions to the thumb. So you have this paradox. The medallion is dumb, it doesn't speak, but then you can touch it and it speaks for itself as old medallions to the thumb. Silent, so you can see the paradoxical movement. Silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. So there is moss, you can see it, it's very visual, and you can even touch it and feel the softness of it. And it's a sleeve, it's like a sleeve. So you can see as if that ledge is wearing the sleeve of moss, right? And then a poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. You know, it's it lifts you by its own merit. It doesn't require a great commentator on poetry to come and make it great. Okay, so very quickly, I will now move on to the way Brooks reads Ode on a Grecian Urn. I will take another 3 minutes and then close. And open the house for a couple of questions or comments. This is how Keats's ode ends. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Now, it's a demonstration of new criticism. Cleanth Brooks opens with Archibald MacLeish's dictum. A poem should not mean but be. So by the very fact that it is an urn, it becomes the poem. And so it's something like maybe even what Allen Ginsberg, who comes much later to be John Crowe Ransom's student at Vanderbilt University, no, Columbia. So Van Doren student at Columbia. So Ginsberg has this beautiful image for poetry and the reader. So you see, the poem is like a charged electric rod. The reader is like a charged electric rod. When they come close at one critical moment, there is a discharge of electricity that connects the two. So maybe that is exactly the idea that the new critics also had, especially Cleanth Brooks, when he writes about the urn as a poem that speaks all by itself. It becomes eloquent even when it is silent. All right. So now Brooks opens with the last line. He says it's very strange that Keats, who normally is very evocative, should end the greatest ode with a statement, you know, and that statement which says, this is beauty. He describes the limit of beauty and he describes the limit of truth, as if there is no need to go beyond it. And it is so unlike Keats's. Now, Eliot, he gives three objections he quotes three objections, three very prominent objections, one by T.S. Eliot, the other by Middleton Murray, and the third by a critic called Garrett. T.S. Eliot objects because he expected Keats to use his objective correlative, and for him that is the only way emotion must be expressed in art. But and it is a formula to bring out the emotion. And what exactly happens through the statement is there is a termination of the emotion. It ends with a statement, and it states the truth, and then it defines the limits of the truth. What is the truth? Beauty is truth. And what is the limit? That is all. All right. So it states the truth. It defines the limits of that truth. Now, that is one. Then the next objection comes from Middleton Murray, who says, I can understand Keats's idea of beauty. I fully understand Keats's idea of truth, but I still want to agree with the opinion of Eliot that there is a violation, and it is a statement that completely obliterates the idea of both truth and beauty. So he also agrees. Garrett also agrees with Eliot and Middleton Murray. Now, the question they ask is, and we will move to the next slide, how can the urn, which is thou, still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. So that is the urn. The Grecian urn is unravished bride of quietness, foster child of silence and slow time. Right? How can it speak about truth and beauty? So I thought they took exception to the fact that such a silent urn should suddenly become very eloquent. Now, these three objections are resolved by Brooks. Brooks opens this question with a counter question, and that's the method of the new critics. They open with a question, and this question actually challenges an earlier position. So it says the question to be asked is not what Eliot, Middleton Murray, and Garrett ask as to whether the statement injures the poem. The better question, or the question that one should really ask, is whether the poem establishes the relationship between beauty of the poem with the truth that it is asserting, because the urn is itself the poem. And this poem, it becomes an analogy of the poem, or it becomes a parable of the poem, as Brooks would say. So he says the question is not whether the statement has killed the beauty of the poem. The statement should be, does the poem, as an embodiment of beauty, assert the truth that it asserts? And are they in a perfect, is the beauty of the urn and the truth that it is asserting, are they in perfect relation? That is the question that we need to ask. And so Brooks goes on to read the poem as a paradox, and we would see so he says, if you have to read Keats as somebody who is on the side of the first part, on which part is Keats? Beauty is truth. If let us say that Keats is on that side, then he becomes an aesthetician. He is for the art for art's sake. But let us assume that Keats is on the side of the second idea, truth is beauty. Then he is on the side of the Marxist critics, for whom art is like a propaganda. There is a truth that the art establishes and propagandizes. So now we will have to resolve the paradox of Keats being both an aesthetician and this. So let us choose is what he says. And that's how he goes on to, and so he says, in order to resolve it, you will have to go back and read the text carefully. And I will only read the text just to expose the paradox of this. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who can thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the tales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens love? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? We will stay with the first 4 lines. You would be able to see that it is quiet, but it is a historian. So Brooks plays on this contrast between the urn that is the bride of quietness and the foster child, not the real child. You know, an actual child should be younger, but this is a foster child, slow time. So it's been around in the museum for many, many centuries. So it's a foster child of slow time, and it is quiet, but then it is also a historian. What kind of a historian? It's a sylvan historian. So either the historian is a forest dweller, a forest historian, or it is a historian who writes about forests and provides the truth. How do we know? It is, although the urn is silent, the urn is capable of the truth of the historian through the leaf-fringed legends and, you know, in Tempe or the Dales of Arcady. So he is able to show that it is in Keats this recognition of that movement in its being static, or the eloquence in its quietness that is holding the paradox and moving the poem forward towards that paradoxical truth, which is the relationship between beauty and the truth that the poem asserts. All right, there are each stanza can be taken for that which is a rock, but that which lives. There is a lover who is not able to reach his lady love, but that is exactly the reason why there is hope, because any moment, because that is still alive, it's not dead, and so on. So on that note, I have spoken about the cultural context, and so let's move on. In 1948, about the time that the new criticism was limping to its natural end, because the neo-Marxists were coming back very strongly, especially the kind of work that the Frankfurt historian, the Frankfurt Marxists were doing in America, like Theodore Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and so on. So that was already influencing literary studies in the university and even outside in the cultural sphere. So new criticism could not continue in its original shape, and it had at some sooner than later to factor the social reality and history that was knocking at its doors. And so the text had to, beyond a point, throw open its doors and be the all-inclusive text that it is, the plural text that it is today. But before that really happened, we had René Wellek, who had moved to America from Europe, and he was trained by the philosopher Roman Ingarden, who also spoke about the integrity of the text. And they have two sections. One is the extrinsic approach to literature and the intrinsic approach to literature. Warren joins Wellek in this project. And so while they start with the extrinsic approach where they say that literature is enriched, the reading of literature is enriched by appreciating its connection to biography, which is life writing, to psychology, psychoanalytical criticism, to sociology, Marxist, neo-Marxist, and other criticism, to ideas, and so on. But they also and then they shift emphasis to the intrinsic approach to the text that is all important. Empathy, rhythm, meter, style and stylistics, image, metaphor, symbol, myth, genre studies, and so on. So something like a manifesto for the future of English studies is laid out around the middle of the 20th century. So I started with Greenblatt, I've ended with the theory of literature. And on that note, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, sir, for a very resourceful and facilitative lecture. It was impeccable. We'll now have 2 select questions for the Q&A owing to the time restriction.
Okay. Yeah.
The first question is from Dr. Sujata Menon. She would like to ask you this. As a creative writer, don't you think that the twin concepts of intentional fallacy and affectative fallacy don't count these days?
Oh, yes. If you look at, life writing, in fact, today, the reading of the text is a much more layered experience. So we would want to know what went on in the reader's mind. In fact, the prefaces of most of these books would tell us what were the circumstances that led these writers to think of these projects and pursue them. So yes, I fully agree with you that there are no more fallacies. In fact, they are facilitating factors and they in fact enrich our appreciation of text these days. In fact, we are these days spoiled by these facilities that we would feel poorer without them. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Dr. Muthukumar. He asks, how and where does new criticism differ from formalism and practical criticism, since all the 3 state that a poem is a realization of an experience rather than of a statement?
Okay, at one level, we can bring new criticism under the rubric of formalist approach. And that is exactly how Wilbur Scott, some 50 years ago, Wilbur Scott, in his organizing of literary approaches, brought new criticism within the rubric of formalist criticism. But formalist criticism, when it established itself, and it was already a very well-developed tradition from Europe, especially the interest in German the philology in the German universities, and then which went on to influence the study of literature in France, the explication, the text, and with the coming of the Marxist, the linguists with Marxist leanings, like say Jakobsen, Shklovsky, Eichenbaum, and all those. It was more of how linguistics could provide more efficient tools to understanding the language that structures poetry. So I thought at one level, the concerns of these critics are fundamentally very different. While reading is the way we would be able to appreciate the work of the new critics, it is language which is the way we would have to approach or understand the work of the formalist critics, by which I mean, the work of Shklovsky and the group, the whole group. Even Georgy Lukács and all the other Marxist critics. So that's how I see them. I hope I have answered the question.
Thank you, sir. That will be it. We wholeheartedly appreciate the promptness in accepting our invitations, even amidst your engaged schedule and making it on this busy day. And we do hope that you will provide your valuable expertise for the benefit of us in the future too. I now invite Ms. Vanmati P., Assistant Professor, Department of English, PSG Krishnamal College for Women, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Kavya. A very pleasant evening to one and all present in this virtual arena. With an overwhelming sense of gratitude, I take this opportunity to thank our resource person, a highly erudite scholar, Dr. Vinod Balakrishnan, for sharing his expertise on the topic New Criticism. So, you traversed across the domains of New Criticism, lucidly deliberating on the inherent complexities of the theory, demonstrating the aspects of the origin of New Criticism, briefing on the assertions of the exponents such as F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards, Cleanne Brooks, and so on, and drawing our attention to the association between literary theory and aesthetics. Thank you, sir, for unraveling the dynamics and the intriguing underpinnings of New Criticism. When it comes to literature, it's the part of literary theory which tends to create a sense of perplexion and bewilderment in the readers. But scholars and experts like you can effortlessly devise approachable perspectives to fathom the depths of literary theories. So, your lecture has left us with volumes of takeaways. It's not just verbally sufficient enough to say that it was a highly exponential and scholarly session. Ma'am, at the beginning of the session, told that they had been eagerly waiting to listen to your session, sir. As a first-time listener, now I understand why. We are left awestruck. And undoubtedly, this would be one of the most definitive critical deliberations we would ever witness. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thank Dr. R. Padmavati, Dean Academic Support and Alumni Relations, for her constant encouragement. I profusely thank Dr. Sushil Mary Matthews, Associate Professor and Head, for being the guiding spirit of the department and motivating force behind our endeavors. Our thanks are immensely due to Dr. V. Mathangi, Organizing Faculty, Literary and Debating Association, for all her meticulous efforts put forth in escalating the department activities to a yet another scholarly level. I thank each and every faculty member of our department for their constant support and enthusiastic teamwork. I thank Ms. Kavya for all the technical support rendered. I thank all the participants for their overwhelming response in making every session a grand success. Once again, I thank one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, ever so much. Until we meet again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Can I leave now?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Dear participants, this will be it for today's session. We come to a close with it. The link to post your attendance and feedback has been posted in the chat box of Zoom and YouTube chat section. This link will be open for responses only till 7 p.m. Kindly fill in your responses within. Thank you. We'll be meeting again tomorrow at 5 p.m. for session 5.